That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, we're going to do something very similar to what we did with the running backs yesterday. We're going to be talking about the fantasy football playoff matchups that we are going to have for these wide receivers. I'm going to go through. I'm going to be talking about, I think, the 7th or 8th worst schedules that we have, whether we should be selling those players and really just cashing out for maybe someone that we like what we're going to be getting during that time period a little bit better, or maybe, I mean, with some of these guys, it's going to be worth just holding off because we're not going to get enough in return for now. But of course, before we get into it, we have to give away some Fantasy Flock Network hats here. And our first winner is going to be from King. And then our second one's going to be APJ. Of course, thank you all so much for being a part of the Flock and supporting the channel. And every time you go down there and drop a like on a video and leave a comment, you get entered in to win a free Fantasy Flock Network hat. And also, make sure y'all go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. On Underdog Fantasy, y'all can actually find player props every single week, as well as weekly fantasy football drafts. I know we've had a lot of people telling us how much fun they've been having with the drafts on Underdog Fantasy. You can draft a team just for week 11, just for week 12, whatever the hell you want to do. And over there, when you use promo code FLOCK and you make your first deposit, they match you dollar for dollar on that deposit up to $100. And something that a lot of people have been mistaken with is, no, your state doesn't need to be legal for sports betting with Underdog Fantasy. I mean, it's pretty much classified as DFS. So if you can play DraftKings, if you can play FanDuel, and you can submit lineups in those contests, Underdog Fantasy is available in your state. You can get in those fantasy drafts. You can go make some bets on player props. So they're pretty much, Underdog Fantasy is available in every single state, minus like Nevada and Washington State, Louisiana. Nevada, they don't want it because the obvious casinos there, but blah, blah, blah. We don't need to get into that. And yeah, let's go through and let's dive into some of these wide receivers. Let's start it off with Jerry Judy in the Denver Broncos here. I was surprised to see this. I mean, you pull it up, and we talked about Javonte Williams maybe being a very intriguing running back to target because his fantasy football playoff schedule is a top 5 schedule in the NFL. Now, I guess this is actually going to be a theme that we've seen this with a couple players on this list. While Javonte Williams on this same team has a great schedule for the rushing defenses, the passing defenses that Jerry Judy is going to be going up against, they're not necessarily defenses we want to be attacking. I mean, he has Cincinnati in week 15. Cincinnati's going to be fine. I mean, you don't have to worry too much about that. He has the Las Vegas Raiders in week 6. Right now, the Raiders are the 6th best defense against wide receivers so far this season. And then for those fantasy football championship weeks, I mean, in week 17, he actually has the Los Angeles Chargers, which have the 2nd best defense against opposing wide receivers. And really quickly, something that we did not discuss at the beginning of this video is the time period that I'm looking at here are going to be weeks 15, 16, 17. You should not be playing fantasy football by the time we get to week 18 because a lot of games are just going to be completely skewed where you're not going to have starting running backs, starting wide receivers for some teams. They're just going to be sitting out because those games may not matter for individual matchups. So yeah, definitely make sure that your league, you're playing your matchups at least for the fantasy football playoffs in weeks 15, 16, and 17. In previous seasons, it was weeks 14, 15, and 16. But remember, the NFL added an extra week here, so you have to move that time period back so we can get an extra week of fantasy football in. So with Jerry Judy, I will say, I don't know if we should be looking to sell right now. Y'all know we have had Cortland Sutton, Noah Fant as sell-high players for I don't even know how long now in this Denver Broncos offense when people thought that Cortland Sutton was going to be the wide receiver 1 here in Denver over Jerry Judy. Clearly, Jerry Judy has come in. Jerry Judy is the wide receiver 1 in Denver. You can't even make the argument. And I was almost entertaining buying Cortland Sutton low a week ago just because with Sutton, I mean, we sold him high 4 weeks ago, and then he comes out 6 fantasy points, 2 fantasy points, 4 fantasy points since Jerry Judy has come back in. If we're going to be looking at what we have had from Cortland Sutton, let's look at Cortland Sutton with and without Jerry Judy, because without Jerry Judy, that's going to be weeks 2 through, I believe, 7. So let's look at weeks 2 through 7 here for Cortland Sutton. And this is a wide receiver that averaged, I mean, right now, 16.9 fantasy points per game. 16.9 fantasy points per game on a season-long standpoint would have made Cortland Sutton the wide receiver 14. So you would have been right behind Mike Evans and Stefan Diggs. So that high-end wide receiver 2, low-end wide receiver 1. However, it's been a completely different story with Jerry Judy in this offense. Week 1, Cortland Sutton, I mean, he has 3 targets, comes away with 2 fantasy points. Week 8, 4 targets, 6 fantasy points. Week 9, 2 targets, 2 fantasy points. And week 10, 3 targets, 4 fantasy points. Honestly, we updated our rest of season rankings yesterday on Patreon. I may have to go through and I may have to move Cortland Sutton down even further. Let me go over to Patreon just to see where I have Cortland Sutton ranked rest of season, because you could never, and I repeat, ever think about going through and starting Cortland Sutton right now. And like I said, I mean, last week I was trying to convince myself into maybe a buy low on Cortland Sutton after we had him as a sell high so long ago. And now looking at where we just moved Sutton in our rest of season rankings, we have him down behind Hunter Renfrow, Rashad Bateman, Chase Claypool, Calvin Ridley. We have him in the same tier of guys like Michael Gallup and Van Jefferson. I think you have to have Van Jefferson ahead of Cortland Sutton at this point. So yeah, we're going to be moving Sutton down to wide receiver 36. He's going to be between Van Jefferson and Odell Beckham Jr. But oh yeah, it's tough with Sutton. And of course, if you can get anything, go through and sell. Now, the case is with Jerry Judy. This is a little bit more difficult because Judy obviously is an extremely talented wide receiver. Now, I am a little bit concerned that this offense is going to be capped overall. But with Jerry Judy, if you're looking so far this season, I mean, he has yet to score a touchdown off of 28 targets. That's definitely going to be changing going forward. This past week, he had 9 targets in this Denver Broncos offense. He's clearly operating as the wide receiver 1 in Denver. I think that probably we would look to go through and sell him if you're a contending team, because keep in mind, if you're a contending roster, the fantasy football playoff stretch is what we need to be thinking about. Clearly, the schedule here is not favorable for Jerry Judy, and especially if the matchups aren't favorable and you are going into the fantasy football playoffs, I'd imagine Judy's right now your wide receiver 4, wide receiver 3 in that area. So if we could package him together with maybe our tight end to get an elite level tight end coming in, that could make a lot of sense. Now, our next wide receiver is going to be someone that I honestly don't think we should be selling right now. I'm going to get that out here. He has the second worst schedule for the fantasy football playoffs among any wide receivers, but it doesn't matter. Terry McLaurin. Now with Terry McLaurin, you're going to be looking at it. He will be playing the Philadelphia Eagles twice, and right now Philly is the 3rd best defense compared to opposing wide receivers so far this season. So obviously, that kind of tells you to avoid the Philadelphia Eagles defense when we're starting wide receivers here. Honestly, I don't care too much with Terry McLaurin, because I think this is a wide receiver that the value that you would get for him right now in trade just isn't equal what we should be expecting going forward. And to be completely honest, y'all know I've never, ever been a massive fan of Terry McLaurin. We were coming out and saying that he wasn't the wide receiver 1 a lot of people were drafting him to be, and instead he was a mid wide receiver 2 based on this Washington football offense. However, I mean, I think that going forward, he's still going to be that mid wide receiver 2. I don't know if you're going to get a much better price tag than that. Right now, he's played 9 games so far this season, and he's had 84 targets. So he's averaging slightly more than 9 targets a game here. And this is a wide receiver that the efficiency shouldn't be through the roof, just because we know opposing defenses, they can go through and they can key in on Terry McLaurin with no other weapons in this offense. I think that with the volume being there, however, and with Terry McLaurin, I mean, if you're looking at the past 6 weeks, you have 8 fantasy points, 6 fantasy points, 25, 6, 11. I'd be surprised if you can actually get a lot in return. Of course, you can go trade. What question we had in the comment section is Terry McLaurin or A.J. Brown in fantasy? What are we talking about there? Go get A.J. Brown. But I think a lot of people are going to be going, oh no, do we want Terry McLaurin, or are we going to be looking at someone like Deontay Johnson? And there we probably prefer McLaurin. Right now, I have him as our wide receiver 15 over there on Patreon in our rest of season rankings. Now, our next team, don't need to talk about this really at all. The 3rd worst team for the fantasy football playoffs at the wide receiver position will be the Cleveland Browns. They play against the Raiders, the 6th worst defense. They play against the Packers, the 5th worst defense for opposing wide receivers, and they play against Pittsburgh. So yeah, Cleveland, I mean, we've been talking about this pretty much for the past month and a half. It doesn't matter who the wide receiver 1 is for this roster. You do not start anybody at the wide receiver position. This past week, a lot of people got suckered into playing Donovan Peoples-Jones, even though we were screaming not to do so. The week before that, a lot of people got suckered into playing Jarvis Landry, even though we were screaming not to do so. The only player, and I repeat, the only player you can play for Cleveland anyway is whoever their starting running back is going to be that week. Overall, you don't care about any of their wide receivers, so it really doesn't matter. If you can get anything for Donovan Peoples-Jones, if you can get anything for Jarvis Landry, I, of course, would love to do that. Now, our next wide receiver, another player that you can't sell. It sucks. He has the 4th worst schedule for the fantasy football playoffs. This will be Calvin Ridley. Now, with Calvin Ridley, the reason I'm telling you not to go through and sell him is what the hell are we expecting to get? I mean, maybe if reports come out that say, oh, Calvin Ridley's coming back for sure, Calvin Ridley will be back in later this year, then If we get the spike in value, maybe you go wash your hands of Calvin Ridley. But for the time being, I actually have him ranked in our rest of season rankings on Patreon as our wide receiver 30 in the same tier as Chase Claypool, Rashad Bateman, and Hunter Renfrow. And the reason that we have him there is simply because this is a wide receiver that does have the ceiling to be a wide receiver 1 if he does come back to football this season. Now, the matchup's not the best. Now, what's really worrisome with the Calvin Ridley's playoff schedule is he does have the Buffalo Bills in the championship week. Now, Buffalo does have the toughest pass defense for opposing wide receivers in the NFL. But, I mean, the matchups in week 15, week 16 aren't that bad. So I would be fine if you wanted to go through and hold on to Calvin Ridley. Even though I think that it's definitely a spot that would be interesting if his name does get announced that he is going to be good to be brought back, and then we get the spike in value, and maybe you avoid with the fantasy playoff championship matchup. Now, speaking of that Buffalo team, let's go over to Stefan Diggs and the Buffalo Bills. With Diggs, y'all know this has been a buy low wide receiver for us. This has been someone that we've been consistently ranking up there as the wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 in our rest of season rankings. Although, I mean, going into this past week, he was a low end wide receiver 2 on a fantasy points per game standpoint. Now, what's concerning is the schedule here. You got the Carolina Panthers the first week of the playoffs. They currently have the 4th best defense for opposing wide receivers. Then you have the New England Patriots the following week, who have the 7th best defense for opposing wide receivers. So yeah, with Stefan Diggs, don't love what we're going to have with the playoff matchups. I think that maybe this is actually a spot where if we can pivot off of Stefan Diggs, maybe if we can get a trade where we send away Stefan Diggs and his small piece and pivot over to Avanti Adams, that may make some sense here. And just to bring up Avanti Adams, we talked about this in a live stream. I can never throw Avanti Adams on a buy low wide receiver video because what exactly are we going to be trading for him? I mean, nobody's going to be selling Avanti Adams at a low price point at all. Maybe the only time we had him on a buy low video was after week 1 against the New Orleans Saints. Nonetheless, if you're looking at Avanti Adams, we know that this is an option that has that historically high touchdown rate. One of the very few players that we can say is going to be scoring touchdowns at a higher rate than league average. He's had 98 targets so far this season through 9 weeks. He's averaging almost 11 targets a game here in Green Bay, and he's only had 3 touchdowns so far this season. This touchdown rate will drastically come up. You have to be extremely excited about what we'll have from Avanti Adams going forward. So maybe given the playoff schedule that we have for Stefan Diggs, given the spike week that we have from Diggs this past week against the New York Jets, if we could go through and package together a small piece with Stefan Diggs to get to that truly elite wide receiver in Avanti Adams, I think that could make a lot of sense. Now, our last wide receiver we'll have on this list will be Brandy Cooks. We'll get to some quarterbacks a little bit after this to make sure that we're not going to be having any quarterbacks that you really don't want on your team. But nonetheless, Brandy Cooks, he has the Los Angeles Chargers in week 16. And one thing that I really want to be pointing out with Brandy Cooks and a lot of these wide receivers that are on really bad NFL teams, like let's go through and let's look at this list. Brandy Cooks is going to be really one of the only players that is on this list. A lot of these NFL rosters, if you don't have talented wide receivers, you're at the bottom of the standings already. I mean, right now you're looking at the New York Jets at 2-7. There's nobody on the Jets in the wide receiver core that you're even valuing. You have the Jags at 2-7. Nobody in the Jags wide receiver core that's being valued. The Texans 1-8. Nobody there besides Brandy Cooks. And that's why we're bringing up Brandy Cooks right now. And then over in the NFC, you have the Giants at 3-6, Washington at 3-6, Seattle at 3-6, the Lions at 0-8. Really the only team completely out of it will be the Detroit Lions. And the reason that we're going to go through and look to sell Brandy Cooks is because it's so clear to see that this Houston Texans organization has no incentive to win whatsoever, that the second that Brandy Cooks feels his ankle being a little sore, the second that Brandy Cooks feels like, you know what, maybe I'm just not feeling, like Brandy Cooks can get shut down this season so damn easily. And with the schedule that's not favorable at all in the fantasy football playoffs, I don't even know if we can start Brandy Cooks. So yeah, if you're a contending team, go through, try to package together Brandy Cooks. Probably would look to wait to see if he has a spike week this week and see if we can get some more value next week. Obviously coming off the bye here, I think nobody's really talked about Cooks for a while. Hopefully we get a 20-point game that we could sell afterwards. Now let's go over to the quarterback position. I'm not going to be talking about a ton of quarterbacks here. Let's just talk about the worst 3 to 4 schedules that we are going to have for these quarterbacks. And our first quarterback position, not really going to matter too much here. The Carolina Panthers, I mean, you have Cam Newton. Cam Newton is someone that could be intriguing based on the right matchup, just given the rushing upside that he may have and also the weapons that you have with DJ Moore and Christian McCaffrey in this offense. But yeah, Carolina will be going up against Buffalo, Tampa, and New Orleans. We talked about this with Christian McCaffrey. But the toughest schedule that you can find for the fantasy football playoffs is with this Carolina Panthers team. Maybe you want to go through and look to move off of DJ Moore as well when we bring this up. And you know what? It's probably better to pivot over and talk a little bit more about DJ Moore here, not in with the wide receivers at Brandy Cooks. And DJ Moore, the issue is, like, it's hard for me to include him on this list because if you're looking at how far he has fallen as of late, right now DJ Moore is technically the wide receiver 23 on a points per game basis so far this season. But it's just 2 seasons for DJ Moore. We've talked about this time and time again. The first month of the season with DJ Moore, this was a wide receiver that on a points per game basis, he was at the very top of the NFL at the 4 spot. And if you're looking beyond that, weeks 5 through 10, oh my gosh, it gets ugly. Let's pull up where DJ Moore has been. He's actually behind Elijah Moore in points per game. He's at the wide receiver 37. He's a high-end wide receiver 4. Over there on Patreon, you'll see that we actually had to move DJ Moore down to our wide receiver 27 in our rest of season rankings, alongside players like Devonta Smith, T. Higgins, Brandy Cooks. So let's add him on as one of these guys that has one of the toughest matchups that you are going to be finding at the wide receiver position week after week after week in the fantasy football playoffs here. Another quarterback that has a tough matchup. I, of course, was not telling anybody to sell this player in the previous few weeks, but maybe now we could think about it. I'm not telling you to do it just yet. Patrick Mahomes. Now, with Mahomes going up against the Chargers, horrendous run defense. But right now, the Chargers are the 5th best defense against quarterbacks so far this season. And he has the Pittsburgh Steelers, the 7th best defense against quarterbacks so far this season in weeks 15 and 16. Both of those teams should be competing for that wild card spot in the playoffs as well. And the Cincinnati Bengals the following week. So these are going to be competitive games here where the defense isn't just rolling over. Now, the issue is, what exactly are we trading Patrick Mahomes for? If you pull up my rest of season quarterback rankings, we have literally just one tier of quarterback. And I think literally if you go through and you send out a survey for 100 different people playing fantasy football and you go, hey, rank these 5 quarterbacks in whatever order you want in terms of who you want rest of season. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, Tom Brady, Patrick Mahomes. I think that you could get really anybody to come out here and respond in any given order with those quarterbacks. I mean, it's wild how you would have to go through and try to just nitpick small differences between each option. I would say that maybe the only trade that you can make at this point that would make a lot of sense would be Patrick Mahomes for Kyler Murray. If you're a little bit concerned about this Patrick Mahomes playoff schedule, knowing that we should get Kyler back sometime soon. Yes, Kyler's about to be on bye, but Patrick Mahomes hasn't had his bye this year either. So I think those could be 2 intriguing sells here. Now, our last quarterback we're going to talk about, don't need to talk about him much at all. Matt Ryan. If you're a contending roster, there's no way in hell you're ever thinking about playing Matt Ryan at the quarterback position during the fantasy football playoffs. So don't even know I brought it up. I mean, technically, he does have some very tough matchups, including the San Francisco 49ers as well as the Detroit Lions, but you're not going to consider playing him anyway. And yeah, that's all I got for you. Thank you so much, of course, for supporting the channel and being a part of the flock. Of course, go down there and drop that like, leave a comment to enter in to win a free Fantasy Flock Network hat. Also, go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. And when you sign up for Underdog Fantasy, you have access to a ton of cool player props. You can go and get into some fantasy drafts. And as we discussed, they're available in damn near every single state. So, of course, thank you so much. I hope you have a great day. And I hope that we see you out in the live stream sometime tonight.